Look at your hand. Turn it over. Flex your fingers. That hand exists because, according to some of the oldest written records on Earth, earlier versions failed. The Sumerians, who invented writing nearly 5,000 years ago, left behind accounts of human creation that read less like sacred mythology and more like laboratory notes, trial and error, flawed prototypes, failed experiments, and us apparently the version that finally worked well enough to keep. The tablets describe beings created before us who couldn't function, creatures shaped from clay who couldn't move properly, couldn't eat, couldn't survive. The gods, according to these texts, didn't get it right the first time, or the second, or the third. They kept trying, kept failing, kept modifying their approach until something viable emerged. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. This story has waited 4,000 years. It can wait a few more hours while you rest. Subscribe and stick around. The most detailed account comes from a text called Enki and Ninmah, discovered on clay tablets dating back nearly 4,000 years. The story begins with the gods themselves doing hard labor. They were digging irrigation canals, carrying baskets of earth, building the infrastructure that would make civilization possible, and they were exhausted. The junior gods, called the Igigi, had been working for what the texts describe as incredibly long periods. They complained, they protested, they demanded relief. The solution proposed by Enki, the god of wisdom, was elegant. Create a new being to do the work instead. Make something from clay that would carry the baskets, dig the canals, serve the temples. The gods wouldn't have to labor anymore. They would have servants, but creating a functional being, it turns out, was harder than anyone. The goddess Ninmah, sometimes called the primordial mother, began the work. She gathered clay from the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean where Enki dwelt. With the help of birth goddesses, she shaped the raw material into forms that might become human. Ninmah, the great mother goddess, also known as Ninhursag, assisted in the process. When the first functional humans emerged, the gods celebrated. They held a feast. They drank beer. And then things got competitive. The tablets describe what happened next in remarkable detail. Ninmah, perhaps emboldened by drink, perhaps wanting to prove her creative powers, decided to shape additional humans on her own. She claimed she could create beings and determine their fates. Enki responded that whatever she made, he could find a purpose for. It became a contest, and the results reveal how the Sumerians understood human imperfection. Ninmah's first independent creation was a man who could not bend his outstretched weak hands. His arms were stiff, unable to grasp or manipulate objects, a fundamental failure for a being meant to do physical labor. But Enki looked at this creature and found a solution. He appointed the man as a servant of the king, someone who could not steal because he could not grasp anything. The flaw became a feature. The failed experiment found purpose. The second being Ninmah created had constantly opened eyes that turned back the light. Some scholars interpret this as blindness, others as an inability to close the eyes, a sensitivity to light that made normal functioning impossible. Enki decreed this creature's fate as well. He would serve the king as a musician. The gift of sound would replace the gift of sight, The floor was transformed into specialization. The third creation suffered from broken or paralyzed feet. Movement was impossible or severely limited. Enki assigned this being to work as a silversmith, a seated trade requiring hands but not legs. The fourth creation could not control bodily functions, could not retain semen or urine. Enki performed a magical bath that cured this affliction by expelling the demon responsible. The fifth was a woman who could not bear children. Enki assigned her to the queen's household, perhaps as a weaver or in another domestic role. The sixth creation had no genitals at all. Neither male nor female, Enki named this being a eunuch and placed them in service of the king's 6 flawed humans, each with fundamental problems, each given purpose by Enki's wisdom. The tablets suggest that these beings represent categories of people who existed in Sumerian society: the blind, the lame, the barren, the intersex. The myth explained their origins while affirming their place in the social order, but then Enki decided to turn the contest around. If Ninmah could create flawed beings and he could find purposes for them, what would happen if he created something she couldn't help? He reached for the clay himself, and what he made was deliberately catastrophic, a being so broken that no divine intervention could give it function or meaning. The texts call this creation Umul. Its head was afflicted, its eyes were afflicted, its neck was afflicted, it could hardly breathe. Its ribs were shaky, its lungs were afflicted, its heart was afflicted, its bowels were afflicted. With its hand and its lolling head, it could not put bread into its mouth. Its spine and head were dislocated. Every system failed, every function broken. A being that was neither alive nor dead, as Ninmah complained. Ninmah tried to help. She attempted to speak to Umul. She offered it bread. But the creature could not respond, could not eat, could not sit, could not stand, could not walk. It was beyond her power to fix. Enki had won the contest by creating something so utterly broken that even divine wisdom couldn't redeem it. The tablets end with Ninmah acknowledging defeat. She could not rival the great Lord Enki. What does this myth tell us? The Sumerians saw human creation as a process involving multiple attempts with varying degrees of success. Some creations were flawed but functional. Others were completely unviable. The perfect human, the working prototype, existed alongside failed experiments. And the text suggests that the variety of human conditions we observe, from full capability to severe disability, all emerged from this primordial period of divine trial and error. But the Enki and Ninmah myth is only part of the story. Another text, the Atrahasis epic, describes what happened after humanity was successfully created. And it reveals that even the functional version of humans was almost destroyed multiple times. The gods regretted their creation. They tried to wipe humanity out. They failed and tried again and again, before finally accepting that humans would exist. But in a modified form, the Atrahasis begins similarly to Enki and Ninmah. The junior gods are laboring, digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. After 3,600 years of this work, they rebel, they burn their tools, they surround Enlil's temple, demanding relief. The solution, again, is to create humans to do the work instead. But this time, the creation involves sacrifice. A god named Wee-Ilu, described as a god who has sense, is selected for slaughter. His flesh and blood are mixed with clay by the mother goddess. From this mixture, 14 human beings are shaped, 7 male and 7 female. They are born from the womb after a 10-month gestation. The mixture of divine blood and earthly clay gives humans both mortality and intelligence. We have the spark of divine reason, but we're still made of dirt. At first, everything works as planned. Humans do the labor. Gods enjoy leisure. But then humans do what humans do. They multiply, they spread across the earth, they make noise, and Enlil, the king of the gods who values his rest above almost everything else, finds their constant clamor unbearable. He cannot sleep. Something must be done. Enlil's first attempt to reduce the human population is plague. He sends disease to cull the numbers. But Enki, who created humans and feels responsible for them, secretly advises a man named Atrahasis on how to end the suffering. The humans concentrate their worship on Namtar, the god of plague, showering him with attention until he is embarrassed enough to withdraw his hand. The plague ends, humanity survives. 1200 years pass. Humanity has recovered and multiplied again. The noise has returned. Enlil cannot sleep. This time he sends drought. He instructs Adad, the storm god, to withhold the rains. Rivers dry up, crops fail. But again Enki advises Atrahasis. The humans worship Adad directly, concentrating their prayers on him alone, until he is shamed into releasing the waters. The drought ends, humanity survives. Another 1200 years pass. Same story, multiplication, noise, Enlil's insomnia. This time he tries famine, a general embargo on nature's gifts. Anu and Adad guard the heavens. Enlil watches the earth. Enki monitors the waters. No nourishment can reach humanity through any channel. The text describes desperate conditions. Mothers eating their own children, bodies filling the streets. Yet somehow, humans endure. Finally, Enlil decides that half measures won't work. Humanity must be completely destroyed. He proposes a flood that will wipe out every human on earth. And this time, he makes all the gods swear an oath. They will not interfere. They will not warn anyone. They will let the waters rise and the humans drown. Even Enki must swear, but Enki finds a loophole. The oath says he cannot speak to a human about the flood. So instead, he speaks to the wall of Atrahasis's house. And Atrahasis, on the other side of that wall, happens to hear everything. Build a boat, the wall seems to say, seal it with bitumen. Load your family and animals aboard, abandon your possessions to save your life. The flood is coming. Atrahasis obeys. He builds an ark. He loads it with 2 of every animal. He seals himself inside, and then the storm begins. For 7 days and 7 nights, the waters rage. The darkness is total. The winds howl like wild asses screaming. When it finally ends, almost all human life has been extinguished. The gods who caused the flood now mourn what they've done. They're hungry because no one is left to offer sacrifices. The mother goddess Ninchu weeps for her children who clog the rivers like dragonflies. She blames herself for agreeing to the destruction. The other gods go hungry and thirsty, their lips crusted with the residue of their own terrible decision. When Atrahasis emerges from his ark and offers a sacrifice, the starving gods descend on it like flies. Even Enlil, who wanted humanity destroyed, regrets what he has done. But here is where the story takes its most significant turn. Enlil is furious that anyone survived. When he sees the boat and realizes Enki circumvented the oath, he rages. But Enki argues his case. He made sure life was preserved. He saved one man because complete extinction would have been a cosmic mistake. And then Enki proposes a compromise. The new humanity, Enki suggests, should be different from the old, less fertile, more limited, subject to controls that will keep the population and the noise within manageable bounds. The gods agree, and from this moment, according to the tablets, we become the version of humans that exists today. Modified, constrained, designed to prevent the problems that plagued our predecessors. The text specifies what changes were made. From now on, there would be women who cannot bear children. Demons would snatch babies from their mothers' laps, causing miscarriages and infant mortality. Certain women would be consecrated to the gods and required to remain celibate. Death itself, which had always existed, would take humans more regularly and more predictably. We would be fruitful, but not too fruitful. Think about what this narrative implies. According to the Sumerians, we are not the first version of humanity. We're not even the second or third. We're the survivors of multiple catastrophes, descended from the one man wise enough to build a boat, and we've been modified from the original design. Our lifespans, our fertility, our vulnerability to disease and death, all were recalibrated after the flood to create a more manageable population. The Enki and Ninmah text gives us flawed prototypes. Beings who couldn't function properly, experiments that failed before the viable human emerged. The Atrahasis gives us catastrophic cullings, plague, drought, famine, flood, 4 attempts to destroy humanity before the gods accepted our existence with limitations. Put them together, and you have a picture of human creation as iterative, experimental, marked by failure and revision. Modern readers might recognize something in this ancient understanding. We know now that human evolution involved multiple species, many of which went extinct. Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Neanderthals, Denisovans. We're not the only version of human that ever existed. We're just the one that survived. The Sumerians, without any knowledge of evolutionary biology, constructed a narrative that resonates with what we've since learned about our own history. The tablets also preserve a profound insight about human imperfection. We're not flawed because creation went wrong. We're flawed because creation is hard. The gods themselves struggled to get it right. The blind, the lame, the barren, the intersex, these aren't mistakes to be hidden. They're part of the original process, given purpose and place by divine wisdom. Sumerian society, at least in its mythology, found room for variation. The flood story carries another lesson. Humanity was almost destroyed because we were too successful. We multiplied too much, made too much noise, disturbed the cosmic order. The gods created us to serve them, and we exceeded our purpose. The solution wasn't to eliminate us entirely, but to build in limitations: infant mortality, infertility, shorter lifespans. These aren't punishments. They're design features of the revised model. Consider how differently this frames human suffering compared to other religious traditions. In the Sumerian view, death and disease aren't consequences of moral failure. They're engineering solutions to a population problem. The gods don't want us to suffer. They want to sleep without being disturbed by our noise. Our mortality is a compromise that allows us to exist at all. The atrahasis was known to later Mesopotamian cultures. The Babylonians preserved and copied it. Elements of the story appeared in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is called Utnapishtim. The general framework: creation from clay mixed with divine essence, catastrophic flood, single survivor, modified humanity afterward, spread throughout the ancient Near East, and eventually elements of it appeared in the Hebrew Bible. Noah's flood in Genesis shares remarkable similarities with the atrahasis and its descendants. A god or gods decide to destroy humanity with water. One righteous man is warned to build a boat. Animals are preserved 2 by 2. The flood lasts a defined period. The survivor offers sacrifice after the waters recede. The deity promises never to send such a flood again. The parallels are too close to be coincidental. But the differences are also significant. In the Hebrew version, the flood is punishment for human sin, not noise. There is one God, not a council of competing deities. Noah is righteous, not just clever, and after the flood, God blesses humanity to be fruitful and multiply, the opposite of the Sumerian gods imposing fertility limits. The story was adapted and transformed as it passed between cultures. If you are drifting off now, consider what the Sumerian tablets suggest about how ancient people understood themselves. They didn't see humanity as perfectly created. They saw us as the result of process, of experiment, of divine trial and error. The gods made mistakes. Some creations failed. Even the successful ones caused problems that required drastic solutions. We exist not because creation was easy, but because someone kept trying until something worked. The texts from Nippur and other Sumerian cities have been read and studied for over a century now. Scholars have pieced together fragments, filled in gaps from multiple copies, argued about translations and interpretations. The Enki and Ninmah text remains incomplete because the tablets are broken. Sections of the atrahasis are damaged or missing. We're still decoding what the Sumerians actually wrote, but the core narrative is clear. Creation involved multiple attempts. Some failed completely. Some produced beings with limitations that were incorporated into the final design, and even after a functional humanity emerged, the gods repeatedly tried to destroy or modify what they had made. We are survivors, we are revised, we are, according to these ancient records, a later version of an earlier draft. The idea that humans are imperfect by design, that our flaws are features rather than bugs, that we were created to serve purposes beyond ourselves, these concepts didn't originate in Sumer. They emerge from the human condition itself. We experience limitation, we see variation, we witness death. The Sumerians, like every culture, tried to explain why the world is the way it is. Their answer involved gods who struggled, experimented, and compromised. Thanks for spending this time with these ancient creation accounts. The tablets that preserve them survived because they were made of clay, which endures when other writing materials decay. The Sumerian scribes who recorded these myths couldn't have known that their work would be read 4,000 years later. They were preserving the stories their culture told about where humans came from and why we are the way we are. The flawed prototypes of Enki and Ninmah and the culled populations of Atrahasis paint a picture of human existence as contingent, hard-won, and constantly under threat. We're here because earlier versions failed. We're here because one man built a boat. We're here because the gods, after trying to destroy us, finally accepted that we would continue to exist, with limitations built in to prevent us from becoming too numerous or too noisy again. Sleep well. And remember, if the Sumerians were right, you are descended from a prototype that worked when others failed, from a population that survived when others were destroyed, from a revised model that incorporated lessons learned from earlier attempts. You are not the first version of humanity. You are, according to the oldest written records we have, what finally worked after the tablets have been read, the experiments have been documented, the floods have been recorded 4,000 years after the Sumerians wrote these accounts. We're still here, still multiplying, still making noise. The gods, wherever they are, must have finally made their peace with what they created. Or maybe they're still trying to sleep through the sound of 7 billion voices all talking at once. And this brings us to a count that some interpreters have noticed. If you tally the major phases of human existence in these texts, you get a pattern. First, there were the failed prototypes from the Enki and Ninmah contest. Then came the functional but doomed humanity that was wiped out by plague. Then the recovered population destroyed by drought. Then the rebuilt population devastated by famine. Then the flood survivors. And finally, US, the modified, limited, mortality, enhanced version that the gods finally agreed to tolerate. 5 attempts, 4 failures. One survivor population that became the template for everything that followed. The title of this video isn't sensationalism, it is what the tablets actually describe when you read them as a continuous narrative. We are, according to this ancient Mesopotamian understanding, the 5th version of humanity, the one that finally worked well enough to keep around. The Sumerians weren't alone in thinking this way. Cultures around the world have preserved traditions of multiple world ages, each ending in catastrophe, each giving way to a new attempt at human civilization. The Hopi people of North America speak of 4 previous worlds that were destroyed, with humanity now living in the 5th. The ancient Greeks described 5 ages of humanity, from the Golden Age to the current age of iron. Hindu cosmology describes cycles of creation and destruction, spanning billions of years. The Aztecs counted 5 suns, or world ages, each ruled by a different deity, and each ending differently. The first sun ended when jaguars ate the people. The second was destroyed by wind, the third by fire, the 4th by flood. We live in the 5th sun, which according to their prophecy will end in earthquakes. Different cultures, different continents, different millennia, yet the same basic pattern. Previous attempts failed. We are what came after. Why would so many unconnected cultures independently develop the same narrative structure? Some scholars suggest it reflects universal human psychology. We see ourselves as special, as the culmination of something. We imagine that the world was made for us and that earlier attempts weren't quite right. The idea of previous failed versions validates our existence. We're not random, we're the successful experiment. Other scholars point to actual catastrophes in human prehistory. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,000 years ago, saw rapid climate change that devastated human populations worldwide. The Toba volcanic eruption about 74,000 years ago may have reduced human numbers to as few as a few thousand individuals. We carry genetic evidence of population bottlenecks, moments when our ancestors nearly went extinct. Perhaps these near misses became the mythological floods and fires that destroyed earlier humanities. The Sumerian version is particularly interesting because it preserves both the experimental phase and the catastrophic phases as separate narratives that can be read together. The Enki and Ninmah text gives us the laboratory, the prototypes, the trial and error of divine engineering. The Atrahasis gives us the quality control phase, the attempts to destroy a product that wasn't performing as intended, and the final redesign that created a sustainable version. Let's return to those failed prototypes from Enki and Ninmah in more detail. The tablets describe 6 specific beings that Ninmah created, each with fundamental flaws. The first had weak hands that couldn't bend or grasp. The second had eyes that couldn't process light. Normally, the third had feet that were broken or paralyzed. The fourth couldn't control bodily functions. The fifth was a woman who couldn't bear children. The sixth had no sexual organs at all. Each of these beings represents a category of human variation that existed in Sumerian society. People with mobility limitations, people with visual impairments, people with incontinence, infertile women, intersex individuals. The myth doesn't present these as random accidents or divine punishments. They're part of the original creative process. They're experiments that produced unexpected results. And Enki's response is remarkable. He doesn't destroy these flawed creations. He doesn't consider them failures to be discarded. Instead, he finds purpose for each one. The man with weak hands becomes a servant of the king, someone who can be trusted not to steal. The blind man becomes a musician, his other senses perhaps high. The lame person works as a craftsman, a seated profession. The myth argues that every creation has value, that even imperfection can be turned to advantage. Only when Enki deliberately creates Yumul, a being so broken that nothing can help it, does the myth encounter absolute failure. Yumul cannot eat, cannot move, cannot communicate, cannot survive. It represents the outer boundary of creation, the point at which even divine wisdom cannot find purpose. Some things cannot be fixed. Some experiments produce nothing usable. The myth acknowledges this reality while still affirming the value of variation. Now consider the Atrahasis again, but this time focus on the progression of destruction. First plague, then drought, then famine, then flood. Each catastrophe is more severe than the last. Each requires divine coordination to maintain, and each time humanity survives because Enki finds a loophole, a way to save at least some people from the destruction his fellow gods intend. The plague is simple. Disease spreads. people die, but someone always recovers. Someone always has immunity. The population crashes but doesn't disappear. 1,200 years later, the numbers have recovered. The noise has returned. Enlil's insomnia continues. Plague wasn't enough. Drought requires more coordination. Adad, the storm god, must actively withhold rain. Rivers must dry up. Crops must fail, but water exists underground. People can dig wells, animals can be slaughtered. The suffering is immense. But again, humanity persists. 1,200 more years, and the noise is back. Drought wasn't enough either. Famine goes further. Now all the gods cooperate. Anu guards the heavens. Enlil watches the earth. Enki monitors the waters. Nothing nourishing can reach humanity through any channel. The texts describe mothers eating their children, bodies piling in the streets. This is almost extinction, but somehow, impossibly, some humans survive. Even total embargo cannot eliminate us completely. Only the flood achieves what the gods want. Water everywhere, no high ground, no escape, except one boat that Enki secretly enabled. Everyone else drowns. The great waters cover everything. For 7 days the storm rages with such intensity that even the gods are terrified by what they've unleashed. They didn't realize how powerful destruction would be. They didn't anticipate missing their human servants. When the waters recede, the gods are hungry. No one has offered sacrifices. No one has tended their temples. No one has praised their names or brought them food and drink. They descend on Atrahasis' sacrifice like flies on carrion, suddenly understanding that they needed humanity more than they realized. Destruction wasn't a solution, it was a mistake they couldn't undo. So they compromise. New humanity will exist, but with constraints. Lifespans will be shorter, though the texts don't specify exactly how much shorter. Infant mortality will exist, built into the system by the demon Pasitu, who snatches babies from their mothers. Some women will be infertile, some will be consecrated to the gods and forbidden to reproduce. The population will never again grow so large that it disturbs divine rest. Think about what this implies for how the Sumerians understood their own existence. They weren't the original humans. They weren't even the second or third version. They were what remained after multiple catastrophes, modified from the original design, carrying built in limitations that their ancestors didn't have. Every death, every miscarriage, every infertile couple was evidence of the post-flood modifications. We aren't dying because creation went wrong. We're dying because the gods redesigned us to die. Modern genetics tells us something similar, though through a different lens. We carry traces of population bottlenecks, moments when human numbers crashed to dangerous lows. The genetic diversity among all humans alive today is remarkably limited compared to other great ape species. Chimpanzees in a single African forest have more genetic variation than all 7 billion humans combined. Something dramatically reduced our numbers in the past. Something created a bottleneck through which only a small population passed. We also know that modern humans weren't the only human species. Homo erectus lived for nearly 2 million years before going extinct. Neanderthals survived in Europe until roughly 40,000 years ago, Denisovans inhabited Asia. Homo floresiensis lived on the island of Flores until perhaps 12,000 years ago. Multiple versions of humanity existed simultaneously for most of our evolutionary history. We're just the one that remained. The Sumerians couldn't have known about Neanderthals or genetic bottlenecks. They had no fossil record to consult, no DNA analysis to perform, but they looked at human variation, at disability and limitation and mortality, and constructed a narrative that made sense of what they observed. Creation is hard. Getting it right takes multiple attempts. Some versions fail. The one that survives carries the marks of the process that produced it. The theological implications were profound for Mesopotamian culture. If humans were created to serve the gods, and then nearly destroyed by those same gods, what did that say about the divine-human relationship? The gods needed us, but also resented us. They created us out of necessity, but regretted the noise we made. They tried to wipe us out, but couldn't survive without us. It is a complicated, almost codependent dynamic. Compare this to the biblical creation narrative, which emerged from the same cultural context, but reached very different conclusions. In Genesis, there is one God, not a council of competing deities. Creation is declared good, not an experiment with mixed results. The flood is punishment for human sin, not divine insomnia. And after the flood, God blesses humanity to be fruitful and multiply, the opposite of the Sumerian gods' fertility restrictions. The Hebrew writers knew the Mesopotamian traditions. They were composing their texts during and after the Babylonian exile, surrounded by these older creation accounts. Their narrative deliberately inverts key elements. Where the Sumerian gods create humans reluctantly to do labor, the Hebrew God creates humans as the crown of creation, given dominion over the earth. Where the Sumerian gods try to destroy humanity, the Hebrew God preserves a remnant and promises never to flood the earth again. Yet the Hebrew Bible preserves traces of the older tradition. Genesis mentions the Nephilim, the sons of God who mated with the daughters of men, producing giants before the flood. Some scholars see in this fragment an echo of the Sumerian Anunnaki and Igigi, divine beings who interacted with humanity in the days before the Great Destruction. The flood itself, with its boat, building hero and divine promise, clearly derives from Mesopotamian sources. For the Sumerians, the repeated creation attempts weren't embarrassing or troubling. They reflected reality as they understood it. The world was imperfect because creation was imperfect. Humans were limited because the gods made us that way, after learning from earlier versions that unlimited humans were problematic. Our mortality was a feature, not a bug. Our disabilities were part of the original process. Our suffering had divine purpose. This acceptance of imperfection might be the most enduring legacy of the Sumerian creation myths. We often imagine ancient people as naive, expecting their gods to be perfect and their cosmos to be designed. But the Sumerians understood that divine beings could make mistakes, could experiment and fail, could regret their creations and try to destroy them. They didn't idealize their gods. They told honest stories about difficult realities. The tablets continue to yield new information, as scholars refine their translations. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature has made these ancient texts available to anyone with internet access. Researchers at Oxford, Pennsylvania, and Baghdad continue to study the fragments, filling in gaps where possible, acknowledging uncertainties where the text remains broken or ambiguous. What we know now represents about 4,000 years of transmission. Sumerian scribes copied these texts from earlier sources. Akkadian scribes translated them. Babylonian scholars preserved them. Assyrian kings collected them. And then the libraries were destroyed, the cities fell. The languages were forgotten for 2,000 years, until 19th century archaeologists began digging in the mounds of Iraq. The fact that we can read these creation myths at all is remarkable. Clay is durable, but so many tablets were destroyed, so many libraries burned, so many texts lost to time and violence. What survives is fragmentary. The Enki and Ninmah text has gaps. The Atrahasis is incomplete in places. We're reading the equivalent of a book with pages torn out, a movie with scenes missing, yet the narrative remains clear enough to reconstruct. If you've made it this far, consider what the Sumerians were really telling us. Human existence is contingent. We almost didn't happen. Earlier versions failed. Later versions were nearly destroyed. The version that survived carries limitations designed to prevent the problems that plagued its predecessors. We exist not because we were inevitable, but because someone kept trying until something worked, and then kept that something from multiplying beyond control. The cuneiform tablets are patient. They waited 4,000 years for someone to read them again. They preserved stories that their original scribes thought mattered, accounts of where humanity came from and why we are the way we are. They're still teaching us, if we're willing to listen, that our existence is neither accident nor perfection, but something in between, a working prototype, a later draft, the version that finally worked well enough to keep. Rest now. Let the mysteries wait until morning. The Sumerians believed the gods created us to work, but even work needs rest. Even the gods celebrated when creation was complete. Even Enki, wise as he was, needed to sleep in the deep waters of the Abzu before he could fashion humanity from clay. Sleep is not failure. Sleep 4 failed attempts. One surviving version built, in limitations to keep us manageable. That is the story the oldest written records tell about where we came from. Whether it is literally true matters less than what it reveals about how ancient people understood themselves. They knew creation was hard. They knew perfection was impossible. They accepted that even gods make mistakes, even plans fail, even the best-intentioned designs produce unexpected results. We're still here after the prototypes, after the plague, after the drought, after the famine, after the flood, modified and limited and mortal, but still here, still making noise, still multiplying, still presumably disturbing someone's rest somewhere. The fifth attempt, the version that worked, you. The archaeology of these ideas is itself fascinating. The tablets containing Enki and Ninmah were discovered at Nippur, one of the most important religious centers of ancient Sumer. The city was sacred to Enlil, the very god who wanted to destroy humanity in the Atrahasis. That his city preserved stories about divine experiments and failures, suggests these weren't fringe beliefs, but central religious teachings. The University of Pennsylvania led excavations at Nippur in the 1890s, uncovering thousands of cuneiform tablets that would transform our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. Among them were the creation texts that detailed how humans came to exist, how the gods experimented with different forms, how the first successful humans were celebrated before becoming a problem that required divine intervention. The Atrahasis tablets, meanwhile, came primarily from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. This Assyrian king, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, was obsessed with collecting texts. He sent scribes throughout his empire to copy ancient documents, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the library was buried in debris, which ironically protected the tablets for modern discovery. George Smith, working at the British Museum in 1872, was the first to recognize the flood story in the Nineveh tablets. His discovery caused a sensation. Here was evidence that the biblical flood had Mesopotamian predecessors. The story of Noah, it turned out, was not unique to Hebrew tradition, but part of a much older Near Eastern narrative about divine destruction and human survival. The connection between the Sumerian creation experiments and the flood narrative wasn't fully understood until much later. Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard published their comprehensive edition of the Atrahasis in 1969, finally allowing scholars to see how the creation, the catastrophes, and the flood formed a single coherent story. Previous humans were created, failed in various ways, were nearly destroyed multiple times, and eventually gave way to a modified version that the gods could tolerate. The implications extend beyond mythology into philosophy. If humans are the result of trial and error, if even divine creators can make mistakes, what does that say about the nature of perfection? The Sumerians seemed to accept that nothing is perfect on the first try. Creation requires iteration. Failure is not shameful but instructive. The gods learned from each failed experiment what modifications were needed for success. This stands in sharp contrast to later theological traditions that emphasized divine omniscience and perfection. In those frameworks, God knows everything before it happens and creates without error. The Sumerian gods are more like engineers than architects. They have goals and materials and constraints, and they work within those limitations to produce the best result possible, which is never quite what they initially imagined. The practical implications for Sumerian society were significant. If even the gods couldn't achieve perfection, humans certainly shouldn't expect it of themselves or each other. The myth provided a framework for accepting human limitation without despair. We're flawed because creation is hard. We suffer because the gods had to build constraints into our design. Our imperfection isn't punishment. It is the nature of manufactured things. The repeated emphasis on human noise disturbing divine rest also reveals something about Sumerian values. Noise means activity, growth, reproduction, the signs of a thriving population. The gods wanted servants, but they didn't want too many servants. They wanted work done, but they didn't want to be overwhelmed by the workers. It is a tension familiar to anyone who has ever managed a project. You need enough people to accomplish the task, but not so many that they become a problem themselves. Modern interpreters have found various lessons in these ancient texts. Some see environmental warnings. Humanity that grows without limit eventually faces catastrophic correction. Others see psychological insights. Our fear of extinction and our awareness of mortality might echo ancestral memories of near destruction. Still, others find political commentary. Those in power, like the gods, often regret creating systems they can't fully control. What remains constant across interpretations is the fundamental narrative structure. We are not the first attempt. We carry modifications that earlier versions lacked. Our existence is contingent on catastrophes that eliminated alternatives, and our design includes features specifically intended to prevent us from becoming what we might otherwise have been: unlimited, immortal, divine ourselves. The ancient Sumerians looked at themselves and saw a working prototype. Not the original design, not the perfect version, but something functional enough to persist. They told stories about where they came from that acknowledged both divine intention and divine failure, both purposeful creation and costly limitation. Those stories still speak to us across 4,000 years. Sleep now. The tablets have been read. The experiments have been counted. The catastrophes have been remembered. You carry within you the result of all those attempts, all those failures, all those modifications. You are the version that works. Not perfect, never perfect, but functional, capable of surviving, capable of creating meaning. As the Sumerians wondered where you came from and why you are here at all, the fifth attempt, the survivor, the modified design with built-in limitations. That is what the oldest stories say you are. Make of it what you will. The gods, according to those same stories, eventually made peace with human existence. Maybe that is the final lesson. Even the creators accepted what they'd made. Even Enlil stopped. Imperfect as we are, we're here to stay. Thanks for spending this time with these ancient ideas. The cuneiform tablets that preserve them will outlast us all. Waiting in museum cases and desert tells for the next generation of readers. The stories they contain have survived every catastrophe since they were written. Perhaps that is the best evidence that the myths were right. Some things are meant to endure. Some versions are meant to survive. Some experiments. Finally, work. One final thought before sleep takes you. The Sumerians preserved these stories because they mattered. Priests taught them, scribes copied them, kings collected them. Generation after generation kept these narratives alive because they answered fundamental questions. Why are we here? Why do we suffer? Why do we die? The answers they gave weren't comforting in the way later. Religions would offer comfort. They were honest in a way that still resonates. We are experiments that succeeded. We are survivors of catastrophes we don't remember. We are modified from an original design that proved problematic. We carry limitations that keep us from becoming what the gods feared. These aren't pleasant thoughts, perhaps, but they're true to the Sumerian understanding, and there is a certain dignity in facing hard truths rather than pleasant fictions. The night is long. The mysteries are patient. The tablets will still be there tomorrow, holding their secrets in ancient cuneiform, waiting for anyone willing to learn their language and read their stories. You are connected to those stories now. You know what the Sumerians thought about human origins. You know about the failed experiments and the catastrophic cullings and the final compromise that allowed humanity to continue. The fifth attempt, version 5.0, the model that shipped after 4 recalls, however you want to think about it. The message is the same. You exist because earlier options didn't work. You are limited because unlimited humans were problematic. You'll die because mortality was part of the redesign. These are old answers to old questions, preserved in clay across 4,000 years, reaching you now in the quiet hours of the night. Rest well. The gods, according to these texts, finally made their peace with human existence. They stopped trying to destroy us. They accepted the noise and the multiplication and the constant activity that made us useful and annoying in equal measure. If they could accept imperfection, perhaps we can too. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson these creation myths offer. Perfection was never the goal. Functionality was. Survival was. Being here at all was. You made it. You survived. You are the 5th attempt, and you are still here. The tablets say so. The oldest written records humanity possesses say that you are the result of divine experimentation, catastrophic failure, and ultimate compromise. Make of that what you will, but know that you are not random. You are not accidental. You are what worked when everything else failed. That is not nothing. That is actually rather remarkable. Good night. The Sumerians are listening from 4,000 years ago, wondering if their stories reached you, wondering if their tablets survived. They did. You are reading them now, or rather, you were, now sleep. The mysteries will keep. They've been keeping for millennia. They can wait one more night while you rest and dream, and prepare for whatever tomorrow brings. The 5th attempt. You, the version that worked.